An old man stood at the edge of his workshop, staring at the house that had once been his dream, now occupied by the very person who had destroyed his life. For 3 years, hatred had consumed him like a slow-burning fire, eating away at his peace, his sleep, and his very soul. But what happened next would teach him the most profound lesson about forgiveness that would not only free him from his pain, but transform him into someone he never thought he could become. This is a story about choices, about the weight of bitterness, and about the incredible freedom that comes when we finally decide to let go. In a quiet town nestled between rolling hills and ancient forests, there lived a carpenter named Thomas. He was 62 years old, with hands that told stories of decades spent shaping wood into beautiful creations. His workshop was his sanctuary, filled with the sweet smell of pine and oak, where sawdust danced in the afternoon light like tiny golden stars. Thomas had built his reputation one piece at a time, crafting furniture that families passed down through generations. But Thomas was more than just a skilled craftsman. He was a teacher, a mentor to young apprentices who came to learn the ancient art of woodworking. His patience was legendary in the community, and people often said that Thomas could see the potential in a rough piece of wood, the same way he saw the potential in people. Everything changed on a cold November morning, when Thomas discovered that his business partner of 20 years, a man named Richard, whom he had trusted like a brother, had been systematically stealing from their company. The betrayal cut deeper than any saw blade ever could. Richard had not just taken money, he had forged Thomas's signature on documents, taken out loans in the company's name, and when the truth finally emerged, Richard had disappeared, leaving Thomas with crushing debt and a reputation in tatters. The community that had once celebrated Thomas now looked at him with suspicion. Clients canceled orders. The bank threatened to foreclose on his workshop. Young apprentices found other masters. In a matter of weeks, everything Thomas had spent his entire life building crumbled like a house made of cards. The worst part came when Thomas learned that Richard had used the stolen money to purchase the very house that Thomas had been saving for years to buy. It was a beautiful craftsman-style home on Maple Street, with a wide front porch and a garden that bloomed with roses every spring. Thomas had walked past that house countless times, imagining the day when he and his wife Martha would finally call it home. Now, every time he drove through town, he had to see Richard living in his dream, a constant reminder of the betrayal that had shattered his world. The anger that took root in Thomas's heart was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It grew like a thorny vine, wrapping itself around every thought, every moment of his day. He would lie awake at night, plotting ways to expose Richard, to make him pay for what he had done. Martha watched helplessly as the man she loved transformed into someone she barely recognized, someone consumed by bitterness and rage. For 3 long years, Thomas carried this burden. He refused to let it go, convinced that holding on to his anger was somehow keeping him strong, keeping him from being seen as weak or foolish. He told himself that forgiveness would mean Richard had won, that letting go would be the same as saying what happened was acceptable. So he held on tighter, and with each passing day, the weight grew heavier. His health began to decline. His blood pressure soared. He developed insomnia, and his hands, those skilled hands that had created such beauty, began to shake with stress. Martha pleaded with him to seek help, to find a way to move forward, but Thomas remained trapped in his prison of resentment, refusing to acknowledge that the bars of his cell were of his own making. The turning point came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Thomas was in his workshop, which he had managed to keep only by taking on smaller jobs and working twice as hard for half the pay. A young boy, no more than 8 years old, appeared at his door. The child's name was Daniel, and he explained that his mother had sent him to ask if Thomas could repair a broken chair. It was a simple request, but what caught Thomas's attention was the chair itself. When Daniel returned with his mother carrying the chair, Thomas recognized it immediately. It was one of his early pieces, crafted nearly 40 years ago when he was just starting out. The chair had been well loved, its finish worn smooth by years of use, but the joints had finally given way. As Thomas examined the chair, Daniel's mother, a woman named Sarah, began to tell him the story behind it. The chair had belonged to her grandmother, who had purchased it from Thomas when Sarah was just a baby. Her grandmother had rocked Sarah in that chair, singing lullabies and telling stories. When her grandmother passed away, the chair became Sarah's most treasured possession. She had rocked her own children in it, including Daniel, and hoped one day he would rock his children in the same chair. The story touched something deep within Thomas. Here was a piece of his work that had brought comfort and joy to 3 generations of a family. It had been part of their most precious moments, their quiet times of connection and love. And yet, for 3 years, he had been so focused on what had been taken from him that he had forgotten the countless gifts he had given to others through his craft. That evening, as Thomas worked on repairing the chair, a memory surfaced from his childhood. He remembered his own grandfather, a stone mason who had been cheated by a business partner in much the same way Thomas had been betrayed by Richard. But his grandfather's response had been different. Instead of seeking revenge or holding on to bitterness, his grandfather had simply said that carrying hatred was like holding a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. In the end, you are the one who gets burned. At the time, Thomas had been too young to understand the depth of that wisdom. Now, with hands that trembled, not just from stress, but from recognition of a profound truth, he finally grasped what his grandfather had been trying to teach him. Thomas realized that for 3 years, he had been the one suffering the most from his inability to forgive. Richard might have taken his money, his reputation, and his dream house, but Thomas had given away something far more valuable. He had surrendered his peace, his health, his joy, and precious time with Martha that he could never get back. The anger he thought was protecting him had actually been destroying him from the inside out. It had not hurt Richard at all. In fact, Richard was probably living his life completely unaware of the torment Thomas was experiencing. The only person Thomas's hatred was punishing was himself, and that realization hit him like a thunderbolt. He had been carrying around a burden that was crushing him, all while believing it made him strong. That night, Thomas did something he had not done in 3 years. He sat down with Martha and really talked, about everything he had been feeling. He cried for the first time since the betrayal, releasing years of pent-up pain and frustration. Martha held him, and together they began to discuss what forgiveness might actually mean. Thomas realized that forgiving Richard did not mean what Richard had done was okay. It did not mean Richard deserved forgiveness or that Thomas had to trust him again. It simply meant that Thomas was choosing to release the grip that this experience had on his heart. He was choosing to stop letting Richard's actions continue to control his life, his thoughts, and his well-being. Forgiveness, he understood, was not a gift he was giving to Richard. It was a gift he was giving to himself. The process was not instantaneous. Thomas did not wake up the next morning completely free from anger and pain, but he made a conscious decision to begin the journey toward letting go. He started by acknowledging his feelings without judgment, allowing himself to feel angry, hurt, and betrayed, but also choosing not to stay stuck in those emotions. He began to practice gratitude, focusing each day on something he still had rather than on what he had lost. He had his health, which could improve if he released his stress. He had Martha, who had stood by him through everything. He had his skills, his talent, his ability to create beauty with his hands. These things had not been taken from him, and they never could be unless he allowed them to be overshadowed by his pain. Thomas also sought guidance from his faith community. He spoke with a counselor who helped him understand that forgiveness is a process, not a single decision. Some days would be easier than others. There would be moments when the anger would resurface, when he would see Richard's car or drive past that house on Maple Street and feel the old familiar sting. But each time those feelings arose, Thomas learned to acknowledge them, to breathe through them, and to consciously choose to let them go rather than to feed them with his attention and energy. It was like learning to retrain a muscle that had been used incorrectly for years. At first it felt awkward and difficult, but with practice it became more natural, more automatic. Something remarkable began to happen as Thomas released his grip on the past. His creativity returned. Ideas for new furniture designs began flowing again, designs that were even more beautiful than his previous work because they were infused with a depth of emotion and understanding that only comes from having walked through fire and emerged on the other side. His hands stopped shaking. His sleep improved. The tension that had resided in his shoulders for 3 years began to dissolve. Martha noticed the change first, commenting that she was finally seeing glimpses of the man she had married, the man who could find joy in simple things, who could laugh freely and love deeply. Thomas was coming back to himself, piece by piece, choice by choice. One spring morning, about 6 months into his journey of forgiveness, Thomas was walking through town when he saw Richard standing outside a coffee shop. It was the first time they had come face to face since the betrayal. Thomas felt his heart rate quicken, felt the old familiar surge of anger beginning to rise. But this time, instead of allowing that anger to take control, he paused. He took a deep breath. And in that moment, he made a choice that would define who he was becoming. He walked over to Richard, the other man's face drained of color, clearly expecting confrontation, perhaps even violence. But Thomas simply looked at him and said something that surprised even himself. He told Richard that he forgave him, not because Richard deserved it, not because what Richard had done was acceptable, but because Thomas deserved to be free from the weight he had been carrying. Richard stood there, speechless. Thomas did not wait for a response. He did not need an apology or an explanation. He simply nodded and walked away, feeling lighter with each step, as if he had just set down a heavy burden he had been carrying up a steep mountain for years. That single act of forgiveness, spoken out loud to the person who had hurt him most, was like opening a floodgate. It was not that all of Thomas's pain disappeared in that instant, but something fundamental shifted inside him. He had taken back his power. He had stopped allowing Richard's actions from years ago to continue determining how he felt today. He had chosen peace over revenge, freedom over resentment, and in doing so, he had reclaimed his life. The transformation in Thomas became visible to everyone who knew him. His workshop, which had been barely surviving, began to thrive again. Word spread about the quality of his work, about the care and attention he put into each piece. New apprentices sought him out, drawn not just by his skill, but by his wisdom and his story of resilience and redemption. Thomas became known not just as a master craftsman, but as a person who had faced betrayal and loss, and had chosen to respond with grace rather than bitterness. People would come to his workshop not just to order furniture, but to talk, to seek advice, to learn how he had managed to let go of such profound hurt. Thomas often shared the lessons he had learned, not from a place of superiority, but from a place of genuine humility and understanding. He would tell people that forgiveness is not about being weak or soft. It is one of the strongest, most courageous things a person can do. It takes no strength at all to hold on to anger and resentment. Those emotions are easy. They feed themselves and grow without any effort. But it takes tremendous strength to acknowledge pain, to feel it fully, and then to consciously choose to release it. Forgiveness is not forgetting. Thomas would never forget what happened, but he chose not to let that memory continue to poison his present and his future. He chose to remember the lesson without carrying the burden. The story of Thomas and Richard eventually took an unexpected turn. About 2 years after their encounter outside the coffee shop, Thomas received a letter. It was from Richard, who had moved to another state. In the letter, Richard apologized. He explained that he had been dealing with a gambling problem that had spiraled out of control, that he had made terrible choices driven by desperation and shame. He had carried the guilt of what he had done to Thomas every single day since. Richard did not ask for forgiveness. He said he knew he did not deserve it. But he wanted Thomas to know that Thomas's words that day outside the coffee shop had changed his life. They had given him the courage to seek help, to face his problems, to begin making amends in whatever small ways he could. Richard had sold the house on Maple Street, something he said he should have done years ago, and he was using the money to pay back everyone he had hurt. Thomas read the letter sitting in his workshop, surrounded by the smell of wood and the gentle sounds of tools. He realized that his choice to forgive had not just freed him, it had opened a door for Richard to begin healing as well. Forgiveness had created a ripple effect that extended far beyond what Thomas could have imagined. It reminded him of something his grandfather used to say, that when we release our grip on the past, we free up both hands to embrace the present and build the future. Thomas had spent 3 years with his hands clenched in fists of anger. Now those hands were open, creating, building, blessing others with the work they produced and the wisdom they had gained. Today, Thomas is 70 years old. The workshop that nearly closed its doors is now thriving, producing pieces that are sought after across the country. But more importantly, Thomas has become a living example of the transformative power of forgiveness. He teaches his apprentices not just how to work with wood, but how to work with life, how to handle setbacks and betrayals, how to choose healing over hatred. He and Martha eventually bought a different house, one they both agreed was even better than the one on Maple Street. But the real treasure Thomas gained was not a physical house. It was the peace that came from finally letting go, the freedom that came from choosing to forgive. When people ask Thomas how he was able to forgive someone who hurt him so deeply, he always gives the same answer. He tells them that he did not do it for Richard. He did it for himself, for Martha, for the life he wanted to live. He explains that holding on to anger and resentment is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. It only hurts the person holding on to it. Forgiveness is not about condoning bad behavior or pretending the hurt never happened. It is about acknowledging the reality of what occurred and then making a conscious choice not to let it define the rest of your story. It is about taking back the power that was given away when we allowed someone else's actions to control our emotions, our health, and our future. Thomas often reflects on those 3 years he lost to bitterness and wishes he could go back and reclaim that time. But he also recognizes that the journey through pain and toward forgiveness taught him lessons he could not have learned any other way. It gave him a depth of compassion for others who are struggling with similar wounds. It made him more patient, more understanding, more human. The scar from the betrayal is still there, but it no longer hurts. Instead, it serves as a reminder of how far he has come, of the strength he discovered within himself, of the freedom that forgiveness brings. Every piece of furniture Thomas creates now carries within it this story of transformation, of choosing light over darkness, of finding peace in the midst of pain.